grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
And Joseph,
Pray for us.
the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Well, today, so we're on page 308, if I'm not mistaken, the apostolicity of the church, right?
Yes.
Where are we? Okay. So for those of you, we use this fundamentals of Catholic dogma, and we are on the section of ecclesiology, so studying the church. So this last section before the next chapter is okay. The church founded by Christ is apostolic. That's a de fide. That's something that we must accept as in order to be Catholics. But it doesn't. It's there's a couple of clarifications that we need to appreciate because the.
I'm sorry, do you have the key? I think I'm not going to use it for you. I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I'll bring it back.
Because there's a difference between the apostolic under the teaching the Protestants have of the church, saying we're apostolic because we have the teachings of the apostles. That's true for us too, but we have the power that came from Christ to the through the hands of the apostles and on down through the generations. So it's not just the teaching of Christ, which is obviously extremely important, but also the power too. So the Holy Ghost that he gave to them, that they themselves received and passed on to each generation through the imposition of hands. So in its origin, the church goes back to the apostles. She has always adhered to the teaching which she received from the apostles. Pastors of the church, the pope, the bishops are connected with the apostles by the succession of office. So it's not just the teaching, but by the succession of the office, because there's a huge difference between just knowing what is taught and having the power to bring about sacraments and having the proper authority. Remember last time that we talked about the three qualities that we must adhere to in order to be Catholic and to stay Catholic is the doctrine, the authority, and the sacraments. So those are the three keys, and those are the three main jobs of the bishops and priests, is to teach, govern, and sanctify. So it's not just the teaching. The Protestants have that understanding that it's just sent to the scriptures, since we have the teachings of the apostles, and the rest comes directly from God to us. There's no mediation in the church. So the proof: Christ founded his church on the apostles by transferring to them threefold office: teaching, pastoral, and sacerdotal. That's teaching, governing, and sanctifying. Pastoral and sacerdotal. And by appointing Peter as supreme pastor and the teacher of the church, Christ willed that these offices and the powers corresponding to them should be transmitted to their successors, since the purpose of the church makes it necessary that these be perpetuated. And then there's a few saints who had made these lineages where they would trace back the consecration of bishops to the hands of the apostles. So there is an unbroken line, so that you can trace back the origins of the bishops all the way back to the apostles, which is pretty amazing. So these are long, obviously long lists. Thank you. And so Matthias, no need to go through them. We just accept on faith that these go all the way back to the apostles. But if need be, we can also prove it. So that's a main difference there that we need to. The main takeaway is that there's a power that comes with the office as well. It's not just teaching. It's kind of like, I remember Fulton Sheen made the analogy that if you take a plug, source of the electricity is the outlet, right? Well, if you take the plug and remove it just 1 inch from the outlet, there's no power. If you remove it 10 inches, no power. It has to be connected to the source, and the source is Christ. Christ giving that power to the apostles at the Last Supper and the giving of the Holy Ghost at Pentecost. So if you remove yourself from it, then there's no power. That's why then with Protestants, their sacraments are not their Eucharist is not Christ. It's not the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. So because they remove themselves from the source of power, they don't have the ability to do that. So the characteristics of the church, the four properties of unity, sanctity, Catholicity, and apostolicity, since they appear externally and are easily recognizable, are not merely properties of being, but at the same time outer marks of the true church of Christ. The true church of Christ, by virtue of divine authority, is constituted and is knowable by the four characteristics which we confess in the Creed as an object of the faith. And that's in the Denzinger, so we know that's official, sound, take that to the bank. Pretty straightforward, but are there any questions about that? Okay, now we move on to a pretty heavy-hitting topic, and this one is going to get a little messy, I think. The membership of the church. So, the teaching of the church. The members of the church are those who have validly received the sacrament of baptism and who are not separated from the unity of the confession of the faith and from the unity of the lawful communion of the church. So, what Dr. Ott goes to is in this second paragraph where it says, according to this declaration, 3 conditions are to be demanded for membership of the church: valid reception of the sacrament of baptism. So once you're baptized, you're a member of the church. The profession of the true faith and participation in the communion of the church. By fulfillment of these 3 conditions, one subjects oneself to the threefold office of the church: sacerdotal by baptism, teaching office by the confession of the faith, the pastoral office, obedience to the church authority. So those are the same 3 things that keep coming up: teaching, governing, and sanctifying. As these 3 powers perpetuated in these offices, the power of consecration, the power of teaching, and the power of government constitute the unity and visibility of the church. Subjection to each and all of these powers is a condition for membership of the church. Okay, so what this is really getting at, this whole section here, is the teaching at base is extra ecclesia nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. So, in a sec, we'll talk about those who are outside the church. But what it means is that if you know that the church is the one true church, you must enter it. So, there was an author, Graham Greene, and he knew that the Catholic Church was the one true church founded by Christ, but he stayed out of it because he wanted to continue in his life of sin, didn't think that he could be saved, essentially, which is an odd condition, but people have that. And he purposely stayed out, I think, until the end of his days, because he was just thought himself unworthy of entering, and that he could possibly be saved. So, what this means is that Christ founded the church and gave her all the tools for salvation. So, not only the teaching, but the means to be saved as well. So, what this means is that you essentially have to be Catholic in order to be saved if you know about Christ. So, there's essentially this: we can break people down into people who know about Christ and whether they accept or reject. And then, so if you reject, that's it. You go to hell. Rejection, I'm talking about a full-on, like, I don't believe that Christ is God. And he said, all right, essentially the line is drawn in the sand. You reject, that's it. Those, I'm trying to think of the passage off the top of my head, but I can't remember what it is. But when he talks about baptism, and he talks about the necessity of baptism in John 2. But he essentially says that if you don't choose me, then you've already condemned yourself. So then there's the people who accept him, but then there are people who are in error. Now there are two ways to be in error. So we can talk about people who are not in error, like the Catholic Church, but people like Protestants who accept Christ, but then they are in error, and then we can break them off into two groups. So those that are what are called material heretics, and those that are formal heretics. So a material heretic is someone who believes something contrary to what Christ actually taught. So it may be their fault that they believe wrongly, it may not be. But they essentially believe something that Christ did not teach. For example, they would say that Christ is not truly substantially present in the Eucharist. That's against what Christ taught, so they are in error materially. It's just objective fact that they believe contrary to what Christ actually taught. Now, what makes them formal heretics is that let's go back to the material. So material heretics can be people who are in good faith. They have been taught from the beginning of their lives or from very young that the Catholic Church is like the whore of Babylon, that she is not the one true church, that she's an idolater, that we all worship the Pope and worship Mary. And so they are in error, but their error is in good faith. So it's essentially like not their fault that they're in error. Material heretics, they can err, but in good faith. So if they err, but are in good faith, and they keep the commandments, they can go to heaven. But it's extremely difficult because you're talking about living in error and still avoiding mortal sin. It's very difficult because we who have the sacraments and all the advantages of the true teaching of the church and the confession, the Eucharist, still have a difficult time not falling into mortal sin and venial sin because of the difficulties of original sin, the inclinations to sin that we have. So we don't want to think, they can be saved, then that's fine. We just leave them alone, leave them in their error. They'll be happy. They'll go to heaven, and so will we. It's not the way it works. So we have to try as hard as we can to get them out from under their error and into the one true and holy Catholic Apostolic Church. That's what we need to do. The lack of this teaching, the fact that this teaching has not been promulgated in the last 50, 60 years has led to the damnation of countless people. So there are lots of people who materially are in error, but are not formally. Now, the difficulty is that they're in error, but could they come to know the truth? With all the advantages that we have, the spread of information, could they come to know the truth? Because therein lies another difficulty. Once they go from materially heretics, well, what about the fact that so they're inculpable to a certain extent? But they still have an obligation to learn and to search for the truth. And with all the advantages of the spread of information, that makes that inculpability much less and less and less. So the chances of these people being damned go up and up and up, which is scary. The difference, though, is that they're in good faith. when we have formal heretics, they're not in good faith. They know that they are heretics. They know that this is against the teaching of the church. They don't care. Those people, likewise, would be on the road to hell. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to go to hell, but they are on the road to it. If they continue down, that's where they'll end up. So now, knowing these distinctions, what we have to avoid is the temptation to try to put people we know into these categories. Because in order to know which category the person belongs to, we have to know what they know and their intentions. And we don't have access to that. So we just need to, all right, if they're in error, we need to try to bring them to the fullness of the truth. So there are, as we said, there are ways to, if you're baptized Catholic, you need to stay in the church. And if you separate, there's two ways to separate. You remember which ones those are? Heresy and schism. Separate from the fullness of the church. Okay, so heresy is a separation by doctrine, and schism is a separation essentially through the sacraments, or rejection of the authority of the church. So people that are performing the sacraments or against the intentions of the church, or contrary to the authority of the church. So a good example of that would be these priests in Germany who bless gay marriages, right? They are acting directly contradictory to the authority of the church that said you can't do that. So those are the two main ways that you would separate from the church, right? Now you have so if we're talking about Christians and these kinds of people, we have to remember to keep them in that there's these two kinds, right? Material heretics, they just remain like this. They can go to heaven, but again, they have to keep to the natural law or the 10 Commandments, which, as we said, is difficult. Formal heretics, they don't go to heaven, but they go to hell. So some of the things, like the more common ways of breaking these are people like who become Protestants. So they're baptized Catholics, they're confirmed Catholics, and then they lapse and they go back and or they become Protestants or something. So now they're formal heretics because they knew, or at least had the responsibility to know, right? Because if you're confirmed, you're essentially you're taking on that responsibility. I know the Catholic faith, and I will defend the Catholic faith. And then you separate from her, then you are a formal heretic and are culpable. Again, don't be thinking about all the people that you know who fall into these categories, okay? Because that's a temptation, is to think, well, I know the specific person. We have the parameters and the principles, but we don't know who actually belongs to each category. It's a temptation to think we can put people in there, but really can't. At the same time, though, if I have a friend or a loved one who has done that and is left, I need to try as hard as I possibly can to get that person back into the church. That's why the church has had such great missionary zeal throughout the centuries. It died tremendously. It's died the death 7 times in the last 60 years or so because of bad teaching, especially Father Bronner, who, just on a side note, taught that we're all Christians just by the mere fact of Christ's incarnation, that we're anonymously Christians. So even a person who's never heard of Christ or a person who rejects Christ is still saved, because when God willed our salvation, that's it. He willed it, and so it came about, and so everyone's saved. Nothing you have to do. There's nothing that you can do to lose it. It's just secured. So it's like, even though he was a Catholic priest, it was essentially like Protestantism on steroids. Because even they said you could lose it, but he essentially said you can't. Sorry, side note. There are also then the people who would get married or reject the authority. Like they get married outside the church. That again would be schism, rejection of the church's authority. Like the church doesn't have the right to tell me that I can't do X, Y, or Z. Contraception is a pretty popular one. All right, so then you've essentially rejected the authority of the church, and now you're separated from her. Now, again, with these, we have to separate again between material and formal, because there are some people who would fall into they can err in good faith, but that we can't suppose that. So even if someone is in error in good faith, we still need to keep them to try to win them over to the truth. So the example then is always, what about people in Africa who are living in the middle of a jungle and have never heard of Christ? How can they be saved? Well, they would be saved through the intercession of the church. So they would still be saved through the church, because if they are, so let me back up. In order for them to be saved, they can't appeal to the law of Christ, because they don't know it. Well, so then what law applies to them? St. Paul says, if they don't know the law, how can the law apply to them? So the law of the Ten Commandments, it's the natural law. The Ten Commandments is the explicitation of the natural law that everyone knows automatically. It's written on our hearts. No one has to teach it to us, that you shall not kill, you shall not steal, commit adultery, and so on. We all know the Ten Commandments. So if that person who doesn't know the law of Christ keeps to the Ten Commandments, they can be saved, because that would be the law or the standard by which they would be judged. If they didn't keep to the Ten Commandments and committed mortal sin, they would not be saved. So yes.
Say if a Protestant in material heresy, they have to keep to the natural law, but virtually no one would be doing that, because so many vast majority contracede without any kind of prick in their conscience. So is there a further distinction of formally rejecting the natural law and then only materially rejecting the natural law?
Well, yes, because there's the natural law there's certain things in the natural law that you have to extrapolate out, right? Because there's very bare bones, okay, so thou shalt not steal, right? So there's many different ways to stealing, and some ways are not so obvious that without thinking about it, you could commit that form of stealing, but then people don't realize that, it doesn't dawn on them that would actually be a form of stealing. For example, if you go into work and you mark down that you worked 8 hours and then you left half an hour early, people will be like, well, I got all my work done, I can just go home. But you got paid for 8 hours. You need to do 8 hours of work for justice. And so to do that, to get paid for work that you didn't do, means then that that it's a form of stealing, but it doesn't actually dawn on them, so they can actually be inculpable of that because of their ignorance. because it requires extrapolation. So that's why we have the advantage of moral theology. These doctors of the church who have taken the law of Christ and the teachings of the church and then extrapolated out. So and then applied. This is what this means. This is okay. This is not okay in specific circumstances, so that we know how to act and have this great guide. Well, if you don't have that advantage, like Protestants don't have that advantage, they can lose lots of those more specific parts. And it could be, in my opinion, I don't think it is, it could be that for them, contraception would fall under that. It's too far of a level of extrapolation. Could be. I think it's a bit of a stretch, to be honest. So, but yes, the point being is that they're materially in error. And let's just say they're inculpable. Well, for us, we have a responsibility then to at least try to get them out of their error, even though they are in good faith, right? So then, but let's say they don't have that advantage of like a good Catholic friend who is like warning them. All right, then it would go back to the prior distinction. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
Just in like, I guess like becoming a formally rejecting the natural law seems a little bit like an iffy, like when does that happen? I don't know.
Right, and now so that's why I'm saying that's why we are not the judges, because as you said, I don't know. Christ does, and so that's why he can and does judge very well. So we know the principles, but how they're applied and who they're applied to and what circumstances, only he knows. So for us, it goes back to this. You're materially in error. I need to bring you out of that error, regardless of your culpability, inculpability, ignorance, whether you're culpable for that ignorance or not. I need to try to bring you out. That's my job, or I should say our job as Catholics. Yes?
I was just going to say that with the church basically downplaying something like contraception, does that make them less culpable because they just don't hear the message?
Right. Yes, it would. Because, like as St. Paul says, well, how would they know the truth if they don't hear it? So
I mean, if you're for instance, a Roman enjoying, the Roman gods and all their, the grave sins that they were doing during that the worship of those Roman gods, and no one, is out there giving them the message, then.
right. So that is this is always like a dicey topic, but you're getting into the adoration of multiple gods. It's pretty arguable that would go against the natural law, because even by natural reason you can come to know that there is one, that God is one. So it seems like they would already be in their error because of that, right? But no, that's the reason why the church sends out missionaries, is to warn people, right? For those very reasons, so that if they're materially or formally in error, it's not really up to us to try to figure out. It's not important to us, really. It's what's most important is that they be removed from their error and be brought to the truth. So, so essentially going back to that question is, there are plenty of things that people know or they could know by natural reason, like that God is one, that God is good, and all these kinds of things. Well, the other problem is that since we have original sin, our mind is clouded, and so we have all these inclinations to do evil and to act contrary to the Ten Commandments. Well, that brings on a whole other set of difficulties, because if you are in Rome and everyone else is doing all these evil things like adoration and sacrificing to demons whom they adore as gods, and doing all and like just essentially giving in to all kinds of the evil inclinations that we already have, it's very hard to then come out of that with some kind of mental sobriety and to be able to reason properly. So like that Aristotle was able to reason so well was real. He's a real anomaly, and like Plato and things like that, because usually they're just so dragged down in sin that you can't think about the truth or use your natural reason to come to the truth. Right? And even Aristotle had many errors. Like he thought that he thought of God as he was a deist. So essentially that God created the world, but he doesn't have anything to do with its governance. And so as smart, as brilliant as he was completely wrong about that. So that's the reason why Christ came, is because we can only get so far with our natural reason. And even then, there's lots of admixtures of error, St. Thomas says. So people like Aristotle can come to know many truths and write brilliant things like Nicomachean Ethics, but still he would make grave errors like that, like that he thought of God as having nothing to do with the governance of the world. So that's why we have a huge advantage of being members of the church and having the teachings at our disposal. So we're on page 311. So the inference then is, among the members of the church are not to be counted. So these people are outside the church. The unbaptized, the open apostates and heretics. So apostates would be people who completely reject the faith. They're like, Christ is not even, Christ is not God, he's not the founder, he's not, just reject who Christ is. Whereas a heretic is someone who accepts Christ, but that is in error about something that he taught. Then you have schismatics, and then you have the excommunicati vitandi and excommunicati tolerati. I don't see really any reason to get into that. But essentially, if you're excommunicated, you can kiss your salvation goodbye. So don't get excommunicated. So the necessity for membership of the church on page 312. Membership of the church is necessary for all men for salvation. The universal church of the faithful is one outside of which none is saved. So this is the unanimous teaching of the church. It's dogmatic. We must accept this. Right? So what we have to then reject by accepting this is the religion of indifferentism, to say that all religions are the same. So what this means is that as the church is unique, then none of the other churches have the power in and of themselves to save a single person. Only be saved by the Catholic Church. If a person is not a formal member, but not a formal member, like they haven't been baptized, they don't openly and outwardly profess the Catholic faith, they can still be saved, but through the church. So that's what we're talking about here, is like the inculpable people, the people who are inculpably in error. They can still be saved, but it's through the church, and it's in spite of their error, not because of it. Right? So this person is not saved because of their Protestant faith. They're saved in spite of their Protestant faith. So the necessity for belonging to the church is not merely a necessity of precept, but also a necessity of means, as the comparison with the ark, the means of salvation from the biblical flood, plainly shows. So what the analogy is that is the bark of Peter, the Catholic Church, essentially like Noah's Ark. That if you're on the ark, You'll be saved from the flood, from the destruction that's coming. If you're not on the ark, you won't be. Right? So that's the main key, is that if you're in the ark, you got to stay in the ark. If you're in the church, you got to stay in the church. If people are not inside the church, we need to bring them inside the church. So it's really what it comes down to. But who then do we understand by being outside the church? So, well, just to back up, one of the when I was talking about indifferentism is the idea that like all religions are the same. So extra ecclesia nulla salus excludes that possibility of all religions being the same, because she's saying that it's the Catholic Church that has the means of salvation. That means the other churches don't. So you can't say then that all religions are the same. And it's ridiculous. I will definitely at some point give several homilies on this. So bear with me if you hear this again. But the idea that many people have now is that because of the similarities between religions, that makes them the same. Therefore, whether you're Protestant or Buddhist or Muslim, you worship God, you do good to your neighbor, you'll be saved. And that is not at all what the church teaches. So to say that all religions are the same is kind of like saying, well, so it's the argument at base is because of certain similarities between two different things, they become the same because of these similarities. So it's like saying, well, you all know who LeBron James is?
Yes.
Okay, so LeBron James is over 6 feet tall and knows how to play basketball, right? So I am over 6 feet tall and I know how to play basketball. So to say that we're the same would be to go to his coach and say, look, if LeBron is in game 7 against the Warriors or me, what's the difference? We're the same. We're over 6 feet tall. We know how to play basketball. Put me in. It's ridiculous. It would be the same as saying a man going to his wife and saying, look, honey, you know, you and my doctor are the same. You're both women. You both care about my health. If I kiss you, if I kiss her, what's the difference? It's the same. Similarities don't make things the same. Just because in two religions, like they say that we worship one God and that we do good to our neighbor, it doesn't mean that they're the same. Like there's one big, huge difference that Christ says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. You say, well, I'm not going to eat your flesh and drink your blood. All right, then you have no life. There's the line in the sand. He drew it. He's the one who decides who gets in and who doesn't. So we have, that's what it comes down to. People reject that, as we saw from that same chapter in Scripture, in John chapter 6. There were many who rejected that. So they were formal heretics because they rejected. They knew what he taught, they knew what he meant, and they rejected him for it. And he does a very interesting thing in response to that. Nothing. Because they knew what he meant. They didn't think that he meant that spiritually and that it was just like some kind of spiritual communion. He used a very specific word, trogein, which means like to munch. Like he used a very almost, it's not vulgar, but it's a very realistic word to describe eating my flesh. And you reject him for it. All right, that's it. You rejected me, and that's it. You reject me. Here, boom, that's it. So obviously, not all religions are the same. The peculiar one is the Catholic Church, because Christ founded it, and he's the one true God. So he's the one who he gave her all the means. So the callousness of so many people is to reject the church and saying, all right, Christ as God and true man, came all the way down from heaven, was born a poor little baby, told us all, if you want to get to heaven, do this and don't do that. And laid it out very clearly. Listen to the church, obey my commandments, receive the sacraments, and people are like, well, I can just, well, I don't think God would do that. I think that he just does something else. Well, God says that he does that. So if you reject that, then you reject God and his authority. You separate yourself from that fold. He has the means to getting us to heaven. So it's not just the teaching, as we went back to, because there are many people who can know the teaching. That doesn't mean that you live by the teaching. That's why we need the sacraments. Because just because I know that it's wrong to kill an innocent person doesn't mean that's going to stop me. Doesn't mean that I just don't do it because I know it's wrong. We all the time we do those kinds of things. St. Paul says that. I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I don't want. Because that's the inclination we have from original sin. Well, we need to fix that. And God has instituted the means for fixing that by the sacraments. So then to separate from that purposefully, you separate yourself from the means, you don't have the capability to save yourself then. Right? He says, you want to be saved? Do this. You're like, well, I don't think that I don't want to be in part of this. I want to be out here and do it my way. All right, well, you can't be saved. That's it. Yes.
Athanasius, he was excommunicated, I think, twice. So ends up being a saint of the church, a fighter for the truth. Arianism ended up being the actual heresy. How do we rectify that? Had he died during the times that he was excommunicated, he would have been, still a saint, I would imagine. And I imagine that there are people, today, the founder of the SSPX. So what's his name? Lefebvre. Founder of
Lefebvre, very different from.
Right. Well, maybe or
Uh,
maybe not. But what I'm saying is, I guess we have to leave that up to God's providential judgment.
Right. Well, in God's providence, he didn't allow Ambrose to die excommunicated.
Athanasius.
Athanasius. That would go back to this excommunicati, tolerati, and vitandi in this section back here. It says, according to the opinion generally held today, which is confirmed by canon law, remain members of the church, the tolerati, even after promulgation of the juridical judgment, even if they're deprived of many spiritual benefits. And then the view adopted by individual theologians that excommunicati vitandi also remain members of the church is not compatible with Mystici Corporis. So, in consonance with the almost universal teaching of theologians, excommunicati vitandi, and only these are to be understood. So, in his case, he would fall under excommunicati tolerandi because he's not a heretic in actuality. So, like, for the reason why he was excommunicated was an abuse of power, but not a real use of power.
Okay.
So he would be materially he would be excommunicated, but not formally, because the formal part, the part that actually makes him excommunicated, was lacking. So this is an extremely helpful distinction. So he would fall under the material excommunicati, but not formal. So he is the inculpable. And that's a whole different scenario there. Yes, are there any other questions?
Yes, yeah, briefly. I mean, like, when you reject Christ, that has to be formal material.
Right, because
Like, that's how, like, an atheist could get in heaven, for example.
no. Because atheist is different. An atheist would go against the natural law, because by natural reason you can come to know that God exists.
Right, but that's also material and formal, right? So you can have material atheist, who's going materially against natural
I don't see how you could be materially
So if you have like a
atheist.
17-year-old who doesn't really understand what he's rejecting, has been told something.
Right. So then that would be so. Anybody with the use of reason then could come to know that, but he would. But a person who is not rejecting, is not so they can come to know the existence of God. So we're talking about theism, just theism, right? At that point, we have to distinguish then between theism and Christianity. There's a huge difference. So he could come to know that there is one God by natural reason without any help from Christianity. So there's no excuse for atheism.
Yeah, I guess there's also like formal and immaterial atheists. If you're just brought up in an atheist culture, you never really, explicitly accepted atheism. You just sort of like might get just brought up that way, and maybe there's also a distinction there.
There could be a distinction in the sense that he must know that there is a God, but his ability can be tarnished because of different factors. So like some people just are not smart enough to come to an explicit there must be one God. So but they can come to have an understanding of God, but it wouldn't necessarily be the explicitation. All right, there is one true God. Maybe that can happen, but what you're really getting at is the environment and whether or not that mitigates culpability. To some extent, yes. So again, we have to we can't. There's obviously as many situations as there are people, so we can't talk about every single last one and try to fit them all into category. But to some extent, environment would mitigate, but would that totally make him inculpable? I would seriously doubt it. Because he has appealed to the natural law and natural reason. So maybe it would take longer, or maybe it would be harder, but make him totally inculpable. I don't see how it make him totally inculpable.
Yeah, for this situation.
Right, yeah, it's their fault.
Yeah.
Would you say it would be similar to someone who had taken their own life, right? They might have mental illness, which could seriously reduce their culpability, right?
Mm-hmm.
So would you say it would be similar?
Right.
In that regard?
Yes. So again, that's because we don't know what that person was going through. That's why we can't say oh, they definitely went to hell, because maybe it was mental illness and not simply despair. So there was mitigating factors. Are they totally inculpable? I don't know. Only God knows. So that's why we leave it up to Him. So yeah, that's why we can learn the principles, but who they apply to, we do a terrible job. That's where we really have to kind of avoid. We really have to avoid that. Is knowing the principles, yes, but only God knows who actually they apply to, because only He knows what they know and what they reject. Because there are lots of people who stay out of the Catholic Church not because they reject what she teaches, but because they reject what they think she teaches. So there are lots of Protestants who read the Bible and are in good faith. They want to do what God teaches them, but because of their they were taught badly about what the Bible actually means. That's one thing that would mitigate their culpability. And then the other is that they are taught badly about what the church actually teaches. So they don't really reject her. They would reject what they think she is. So if they think that we are adoring idols, since they would be right to not join the Catholic Church. So that's why it's up to us to dispel them of those false notions. Right? So. Any other questions? Okay, let us pray and then we'll give the blessing. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost.
Was it is now, never shall be, world without end.
Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Pater et Filio Spiritus Sanctus, scedat super vos et semper. So just a reminder, there's our, so we won't meet again for a little while just because Christmas and